What does epistle mean? Yeah. It's just the word for letter. There are many letters or epistles in the New Testament. We talked about the 4 genres before. There are Gospels. There's one, Acts. We're going to talk about Acts today a little bit. Acts just contains stories about what Jesus' disciples did after he was gone. There's the Revelation, which is an apocalyptic text. And then last, there are a ton of letters. Now, most of them are literally letters, like they were written like an email, right? You're writing a letter to someone else concerning a particular topic. Some of them, like for instance, the quote-unquote letter to the Hebrews is written like a letter, but it was probably just a treatise that somebody made look like a letter. The letters that we're going to read by the Apostle Paul are letters. They're letters that he wrote to churches that he had helped start. Now, what does pseudonymous mean? I said a letter was pseudonymous.
It means it's written by somebody other than who it says it's written by?
Yeah. It's pseudonymous when there's a false attribution of an author. If I write a letter to Jenny stating my love for her and sign it Anthony, right? That would be pseudonymous. I put Anthony's name on it, but it's not really from Anthony. There are Pauline letters that are attributed to Paul that almost all scholars think Paul did not write. They are pseudonymous. They're attributed to Paul, but Paul did not, in fact, write them. There are 13 Pauline letters total, plus Hebrews. Which makes 14, but it doesn't even say that in the text that Paul wrote Hebrews. So Hebrews is not even included. But let's look at a letter real quick. Let's just look at the first one. After the Gospel of John and Acts is the letter to the Romans. Open up to Romans 1. If you look in the textbook that's, the Bible that was in the bookstore, it's on page 152. The letter to the Romans. If you look right at the beginning, chapter 1, verse 1, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the scriptures, the gospel, blah, 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 blah. Look at verse 7. To all God's beloved in Rome who are to be called saints. This is like, at the top of an email it says to and from. This is how these ancient letters would start. Who's writing it? It's from Paul, and it's to God's faithful in Rome. Flip just to the next one. After Romans, we get 1 Corinthians. It's on page 165 in the Bible that we have from the bookstore. 1 Corinthians. This letter starts the same way. Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and our brother Sosthenes, to the church of God that is in Corinth, right? From, to, starts the same way. Now there are 13 letters that start more or less like that in the New Testament. Hebrews, look at Hebrews. This will be on page 217. If you look on 217, the very first line, long ago God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets, blah, blah, blah. Does that look like a letter? It doesn't start out with from and to? No, it says the letter to the Hebrews, but it's not really a letter. And it doesn't even say that it was written by Paul. Like all the other 13 that were at some point attributed to Paul, Hebrews doesn't even start like that. So Hebrews is this anomaly. It's unclear why Christians for so long said that Paul wrote it, because it doesn't say that Paul wrote it. So most scholars separate that out from the 13 Pauline letters, and then Hebrews they mention because traditionally it's attributed to Paul, but nobody thinks Paul wrote it anymore. Or few people think Paul wrote it anymore. Now, within the 13, scholars distinguish between the authentic Pauline letters the Deutero-Pauline letters, pastoral epistles. If you look in the textbook, look on page 182. Most scholars today divide these 13 letters into 3 different groups. Now all 13 of these start the way that we were just looking, where they say from Paul to a particular church. If you look at the bottom of 182, there are the undisputed, the authentic Pauline letters, which include Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. You don't need to know exactly that list, but there are 7 that scholars think it's undeniable that Paul wrote those. The Deutero-Pauline epistles includes 3, and what does Deutero-Pauline? What's unique about this group, as far as scholars are concerned?
Like both or either.
What's that?
Not written by Paul, or something Paul teaching.
Yeah, they're kind of on the border. They may or may not have been written by Paul. There's a good chance that they weren't. However, they do seem to reflect the sort of themes that Paul wrote with, right? Have any of you taken Philosophy 101, where you study a little bit about Plato and Socrates? Right? Plato came before Socrates, Socrates came before Plato. Plato wrote a bunch of stuff that he attributed to Socrates, but it was probably stuff that Plato himself made up. But he attributed it to Socrates because it was like the sort of thing that Socrates would have said. Right? Scholars would say, well, the Deutero-Pauline, they may not have been written by Paul, but they were probably written by people who were following more or less closely the types of things that Paul would have said. How are the pastoral epistles distinct? 3 of them as well. How are the pastoral epistles different?